thank you again for inviting me. It's early in the morning in India, and I am currently like sitting in Jaipur in the northwest of India. Although I grew up in Calcutta, it's in the east of India, and for the last 16 years, I've been staying in the south of India, which is in Bangalore. And uh, just this description is, I think, good enough to say how many different places and complexities I hold on a day-to-day basis. That's very much my life. I work across the world, uh, very rooted in wherever I go, in the local realities uh, and the local context, but in the I mean, in the context of a very globalized world, I would like to call myself a cosmopolitan local, because I feel that at any given point in time, I'm holding the meaning of so many places and spaces all together with respect to what I do, what I think, how I look at the world. And I was very intrigued when I got an invitation to speak over here. I do share a lot of my learnings and discoveries in multiple forums around the world. I'm not a big believer of giving talks, although I end up giving talks a lot of times. But I'm always aware of, how in a world where we are constantly bombarded with textual and visual and all kinds of information, there is a saturation that we all sort of experience, and always wonder why would someone want to listen to me. So I am a big believer of actually having dialogues and interactions as opposed to giving talks. Uh, and in a situation like this, where I am unable to sort of interact with all of you or any of you, in person, I always think about what might make somebody maybe listen to this, whether live or a recorded version of it. And all of us have our own biases with respect to who we are, how we think, etc., etc. So our positionality, of course, dictates what we sort of do. So from that sort of space, I made some assumptions. I always love to learn about what someone has learned from not only their so-called successes, but also their so-called failures. I love to hear about stories, and that's pretty much what I'm planning to do today. I thought that I'm going to share a story of my life, if I may put it that way. And I'm one of those people. I really can't separate between my life with respect to work and what people call as life, because I almost pretty much 24/7 think about what I do, not in a way in which a lot of times people call it like a workaholic. That's a term I sort of avoid and I do not like. I believe that the kind of work I have been fortunate enough to do allow me to constantly be in the presence of myself, of other people, of contexts. So it's almost impossible to sort of create these kind of separations and silos and say, okay, well, this is when my work begins and this is where my life begins. So I am therefore talking about uh, the journey that I'm talking about today is not really about the kind of projects that I've worked on. Of course, we all do projects, but this is more like my life's project, in which there are different destinations, in which I would say, life and work and play all intersect and interweave. And I pick my little learnings from each space. So there's a story behind how and why I'm sharing what I'm sharing today. You can see that I'm calling it the duality paradox. The image that you get to see, the illustration over here, is also from a project that I had led. It's not done by me, but again, I'm going to talk about that. I mean, the illustration, as you see, the form of this is not me, but a team member. So the thing is that I am a Salzburg Global Fellow. A few years back, I was chosen as a Salzburg Global Fellow for a very interesting program called the Japan India Transformation Technology Network. And there were people with some kind of background in Japan, people with some kind of background in India, and I'm using the word background because the network does not necessarily require you to be an Indian or a Japanese. You can be an American, but might be doing something to do with either India or Japan, could be stationed in one of these places or may not. Um, there was a very interesting session which many of you might know about. It's a framework or an approach, I would say. It's called Human Library, where every human being, as a part of that session, is treated as a book. So you are not talking about a book, you are not sharing a book, but you become the book in a library, and that's a human library. And the idea is that whoever comes to that library, another human being, they read you like they read a book. And some of us were chosen to share about our work as if we were the books. And when that happened, I started thinking about, okay, if I become a book and I have to talk about my life and my life's journeys, we were particularly asked to reflect upon the kind of work that we do and then share it like others can come and read it. So I sort of pondered over it, and I thought that, oh, well, if I become a book, and I believe that, like other people, I can be many books, but if there is one book that I have to be, that would be called the Duality Paradox. Because I think if I look into my entire life's journey, it has always been finding dualities, looking at the fallacies and the limitations of binaries that people create and transcending those, and also holding both, and I feel that it's very, very important to think about it, because my experience in working in multiple contexts across the world, across many years now, I have been realizing, which I'm assuming many of you might agree with, the world is becoming extremely polarized in every possible way. And sometimes uh, we can understand the polarization very easily, because there are leaders, there are contexts, there are situations, there are phenomena, there are events which are happening where it's very easy to detect and identify and call it polarized. But where I find more problem is where the polarization is very much what is guiding any action of ours, because we we don't even realize sometimes that our beliefs are polarized, our actions are polarized, our choices are polarized, and hence the consequences also get into one side of the two, and we do not have any space to hold anything in the in between, or even to sort of think that the world can be beyond this. So I feel that I have always felt very strongly about it, and I felt that design does play a major role, at least for me, as an approach to go past this and hold these and understand it as a paradox. So I do believe that juxtaposition is a very central approach, if I may put it that way, in anything that I do or how I look at the world. And I mean, paradox is also some kind of a play for me. And that's why I thought that, okay, well, this will be about the duality paradox. I would like to share about it. So when I was invited to give this talk, I was just thinking, what do I want to share about? Because, I'll just tell you the difficulty I was experiencing. On one hand, wearing the hat of DAP Center, which is the Design Led Innovation Collective that I had co founded along with my co founder, Probal. I had probably worked on 120 plus projects in the last 9 years. The institution where I teach, I have taught there for 16 years, and I head a program over there. And being a transdisciplinary practitioner, I teach across undergrad and postgrad and do many different things, And I have probably taught more than 150 courses or units or modules. And then which ones do I select and which ones do I not? Because I just do so many different kinds of things. So I thought that rather than focusing on one or two or three examples or case studies, the duality paradox should be about the dualities that somewhere bind these kinds of experiences in my life together. Okay. And if you see, I mean, I'm a big believer of communication through visuals as well, and reading images reading places, not just reading texts as we typically see. I chose this one because I feel in a lot of the cases, the kind of work that we do, for example, I have an initiative called the City as Text, where you read a city like you read a textbook, right? You again see, there is always this dichotomy a lot of people are falling into the trap of, which is like, let's say, nature and culture. To me, they're not separate. They talk to each other. So similarly, whenever we think about a city, predominantly, or places, you have an image, and I'm going to the next one. You see this kind of a separation, right? That you only see buildings and skyscrapers and all of that, and then you suddenly feel that, oh well, if I need to feel and face nature, then you again think about trees as separate. But if you see what this one does, um, it actually creates a bridge, because I cannot think of one existing without the other one, because it is not about just one end of the spectrum of anything. So here am I. I do not like to be confined with respect to designations and positions and those kinds of ways of being. Uh, this is pretty much what you would find if you come on my social media. I like to believe that I'm a meta facilitator, because I believe that everything that I do facilitate, but at a meta level. I mean, facilitation of dialogues, facilitations of collaborations, facilitations of impact or co-design. I mean, design to me is an act of facilitation, absolutely. Similarly, I do believe that I do attempt to be and remain a narrative designer. It's not really any one kind of narrative, but a big part of narrative design to me, and is to find narratives, not just frame narratives, right? So that act of finding narratives also is a very, very important thing, because I do believe that it allows for multiple perspectives to come together, to coexist, to speak to each other, through which design happens. Similarly, I believe that I'm a learning curator, where learning happens in every possible encounter. There are possibilities of learning everywhere, and I always like to look at whatever I do, whether it's teaching or research or designing any sort. I do believe that everybody is learning, even if it's a new way of being. You are unlearning maybe an old way of being and relearning something. So keeping the learning lens alive becomes very, very important, to understand how everyone learns differently, everyone looks at opportunities of learning differently, and hence the way possibilities need to be crafted should be done differently. And that way, my journey in in this kind of a duality paradox becomes that of a curator, more than anything else. Um, no prizes for guessing that one has to remain a dialogue weaver. And I'm using the word remain repeatedly, because I feel, again, my little experience in 20 plus years of experience is that um, it's not just important and or significant to become something or somebody. It's more important and more difficult to remain that, because one can be someone, but how do you stay that? And it's a constant practice. So likewise, I do believe that I like to frame possibilities as a possibility framer, and uh, bring in thinking in a very visual form. And when I say this, I do not necessarily mean only drawing in a very typical way, but I do believe that my work is that of someone who makes my own and other people's thinking visible. And it's a very, very important part of the work that I do. So I'm going to, for the next half an hour or so, or 40 minutes or so, take you through some of the dualities and the paradoxes of those, by posing the dualities as I have seen. And there's obviously nothing right and wrong about it. It's just my way of experiencing and my way of sense making. And the way in which you would see things on my screen, sometimes with images, sometimes just with words, like you are seeing now, is that I'm going to talk about the duality, and then also talk about what, in my experience, can act as a bridge between this and what helps in transcending the duality. So one of the obviously stereotypical dualities that we constantly become entrapped in is the idea of problem and solution constantly. No matter how much we talk about the limitations of these, I have seen whether it's in the world of design or technology, whether it's in the world of art or activism. You name uh, a sector, a discipline, a domain, whether people use this term or not, but we are very conditioned to look at things in terms of a problem. We want to quickly solve a problem, because I do believe it's not like people are all bad. I don't believe in that people are only bad or unkind, although there is no dearth of unkindness in the world. We all know that. But I feel that our minds are very fast in trying to locate a problem, because it makes us also feel good when we feel we have solved them, right? So I believe that we are conditioned that way, right? We try to locate a problem and then we try to give a solution, however we do it. And the way in which this can be bridged, at least in my little experience, is by locating the dilemma, because there is always dilemma embedded in any problem and any solution, in our ways of looking at a problem and in our ways of acting upon that problem, as we call it, and walking towards a solution. Because I do believe, in my experience, because the world is so interconnected, so interdependent, and so interrelated, that anything that is seemed, that is framed as a solution for someone is going to be somebody else's problem. And if we don't have this realization, if we feel that, oh, this is one solution which is a solution for all, I only feel that it only shows and proves how little we have understood the context. Because it can never really be that something is a uniform problem or a universal problem, and likewise there can be a uniform solution or a universal solution. I have always noticed that. Why am I saying dilemma becomes a bridge? Because I do believe that dilemma is always about taking action. uh, Before we pose a solution, before we jump into somehow solving something, if we can understand the dilemma of different kinds of people, or the dilemma of posing a solution, or the dilemma of whether to call it a problem and whose problem is it anyway, and whose problem are we then solving, and whose problem then we are not solving, and whose problem are we creating by giving a solution. That dilemma, if one can experience and encounter, becomes that bridge that allow us to understand the limitation of this kind of a way of seeing and being. I'm not saying one can't solve problems or one can't attempt to. That's not what I'm talking about. But I feel that it's very important, especially for people like designers and artists, who feel that they are capable of addressing problems, and therefore offer solutions. I feel that it makes us humble. That humility comes from the experience and the encounters of dilemma. So like that, I feel this again, I feel, is becoming increasingly a buzzword, where, I mean, I think 5 years back, when I didn't probably hear so many people talking about this particular point that I'm mentioning, um, you would talk about design for people, design for social good, design whatever. It was a given. I've always seen that then when we talk about for, there is an underlying or subliminal or hidden against always. So I have always been very fond of the word with, or I mean the term with, you know. But I'm seeing that as a buzzword these days, because we are constantly talking about the with, designing with people and with something, using terms like co-design, co-creation. And I always question, that, I mean, again, I don't think some or people mean something bad, or they are superficial, or being frivolous about it. But it's a trap that we often fall into, where we just think about a very superficial level of participation or consultation, and then we think that people are really co-designing. So I think it's very important to be very, very aware of this. In some way, when we use terms like designing for, I mean, it has its own kind of limitations. But the day when you have the realization that it needs to be with, the penny drops and you understand. But then when you use the terms like with, and then are not aware of where the problems or the limitations of those are, that's where it becomes more tricky. So the other thing in connection with this is this whole thing of us and them. And of course, I feel my experience tells us that we becomes a very, very important way to look at it. And I'll give you an example of these three or four things in a minute or so. What do I mean by we? I'm again being a little critical about, sometimes all of us do this. It's easy to look into the binary of us and them and talk about it and saying, well, don't do this. Let's not discriminate. Let's not create othering and all of that. We use terms like belonging. I'm not particularly talking about an interplay of words only, although I'm a very big believer of looking into language, because language has its poetics, but language has its politics, as we know. I do believe that sometimes when we keep using terms like we have done, we will do, and all of that, the I gets lost in that, and not particularly in an ego dissolving way. It also sometimes gets lost in a way in which we can shrug off our responsibility. Because when we say we need to do it, it almost is like some of us should be doing it, which may not be me in particular. We need to be doing this for the climate, or we need. I mean, who are the we? So I'm very conscious about that. So I always question, how do I locate myself, and whoever is using this first person collective kind of a way of addressing anything. When we say it in a plural way, where is the plurality, and how do I situate myself in that plural fabric of anything that we talk about? Having said that, I do believe a lot of times that using a second person way in anything in our language becomes a way in which we give instructions. That becomes problematic because it feels like someone is talking at you in a way in which there is a separation. And a third person way, obviously, we understand, can become very impersonal. So I'm a very big believer of using languages like a first person plural, which allows us to think in a slightly different way, as if you are having a dialogue with yourself. And likewise, I believe that there's probably a paradox of a separation that we create, which is about thinking and doing. I mean, I've been in many spaces where people will be like, oh, too much of words like design thinking or anything, systems thinking and futures thinking and name it, right? And then there will be people who will be like, okay, can we talk about doing and not really thinking, and all of that. I do understand the critique or the arguments behind those, but I feel like I like going past these, and I feel that the bridge between thinking and doing of any sort, even without these terminologies, are really reflective conversations. So I will quickly show you a project that I had been fortunate to be a part of a few years back. European Union National Institutes for Culture, UNIC, uh, gave a call out for creating a toolkit which would help in fair collaboration in international cultural relations. Okay, and I was a part of a global team, and D Epicenter, the design-led collective that I lead, or rather co-lead, we were the design partners of it. And you can, if you're interested, you can look at it at the unique website, and you can find this. Incidentally, we had gotten an award for it from Parsons School of Design called Good Interventions, which is where we sort of talked about how we had used design as an approach and dilemma as a design principle in doing this entire work. This was happening at a time when the pandemic was very much there. And because of that, we could not interact with people in person. Everything happened online. And the point was that, of course, there was a felt need to speak about fairness in collaboration, and a recognition of the fact that collaboration is not just about coming together and people just doing some work together, but collaboration is also about like much more, right? So then, how can a toolkit really help? Like, can it really help? And in our conversations with more than 200, 300 people around the world, where we used a lot of visual forms of research and many other ways in which we try to speak to different kinds of people, we realized that we needed to look into the very root of the word, let's say fairness, and other associated concepts. Everyone told us in our research that they do not want yet another toolkit, because there's no dearth of any toolkit or guides and playbooks, etc., manuals. And most people realize that many times they're good to look at, but people don't really know what to do when they use it, because it makes you feel good, but then what do you do with it? It is not actionable in the real sense of the term. So actually the term came from there, not a toolkit, because people didn't want a toolkit or yet another one. And we called it a reflection because it's a reflection and action kind of a toolkit, which had the belief that reflection can't exist without action and action can't exist without reflection. So it was an evaluation framework through which we had designed everything, where we even designed the research of it in a very different way. So it was really a very unique position and situation where a toolkit was designed for, especially the context of unique, where it wasn't where some experts on cultural diplomacy and cultural relations created the content and then it went to a graphic designer for them to make it pretty, which pretty much used to happen a lot of times. This really allowed people to talk about um, what could work, what would not work. You can see, we used to have a lot of these sessions. We used to go past linguistic barriers. We used to talk about how what is fair for some may not be the same for the others. And many of these people who you can somewhat see on the screen, these were not people who would talk beyond, like words, right? So we used a lot of visuals, as I said, as provocations, as hooks to create the constructs, went past form, function, and aesthetics, and sort of looked into how, questions, dilemma, inquiry could be narrative threads to bind a lot of these things together. What would be the building blocks? What could be ways of seeing and imagining and doing and all of that? What would give us direction? And with that, we created this toolkit. And some of the cards, the yellow ones that you get to see over there, actually is a part of the toolkit. I mean, there are visual journals that one can work with. There are elements in this toolkit where one can work at an organizational level, one can work at an individual level, one can work at a peer level, from budget related ideas and program management to thinking about words. It had possibilities for all. But these cards that you can see over there is a part of the toolkit, and we call it the fair reflection game, where the game is done or designed around values and dilemma that one encounters in real situations, which are all around the values. And all of these situations that we created, which one has to go through in these games, actually came from real experiences. So this is again, like if you see these two images, it came from a process of real co-design. And if you noticed, for the first image which I had shown on my screen, where there was the cityscape and then there were the trees, even in this one, I always want to have a dialogue about it. I do not necessarily believe that the person who was the end person to give it this shape is the illustrator of it. And I've had these conversations with all of these people in my team or in our team, that oftentimes the ideas of what would make this composition came from people through research. And there are 200, 300, 500 people who might have contributed to the ideation. The metaphors, the imageries, the colors, the elements, a lot of different things, concepts came from different people. So eventually, even the positioning of things, I mean, like one of these things is obviously equity. The other one, like on this screen that you can see, is about dialogues and, how dialogues are intersecting with each other. So I have always also questioned that is someone who's giving that last touch because you have a certain illustration style, would you say that that person is the illustrator and not someone who conceptually contributed? And so many of the other people who you would not even remember, who you have encountered in your research, right? So that way, to me, there is no one author of any of these. And I have questioned that. It's not easy, for people who are good at giving shape and giving form to something, to let go of that authorship because they want to be acknowledged for it. My question, and as a counter to that, is what about the authorship which is not form based, as one can perceive, in a very tangible kind of a way like this? How can we erase all of that and then just give it one name? So I have always questioned that. So that sort of takes me to the other kinds of dualities I have often gone past. And again, probably a very relatable one for most designers of any sort is talking and making. And I feel that the bridge between these two is meaning making, really. And likewise, whether we want to believe it or not, I mean, it may not be a language we use often. We like to use words like transformation because they're big words, but very difficult to do. So we try to reform. So reformation and inaction, because like sometimes we don't even want to act upon it, and sometimes when we say we are bringing in a change, we actually want to reform. It comes from this kind of a problem solution mindset and space, I feel. My favorite in this actually are shifts, because I do believe that creating and designing smaller shifts and little shifts can actually bring in transformation than trying to constantly talk about big things, because it doesn't always happen that way. So incremental little shifts, which are sometimes not even perceived easily, are really where design can play a role. And so some of the images which I will show you over here are, I mean, there are three different projects from where I had taken these examples. So on top, it's actually a group of young girls from a slum in eastern India with whom we worked. And our work was actually to create an organizational narrative and give it an interesting storytelling form with which, the co-founders could actually go and speak to the world about. And we actually said that the stories should come from the people with whom you really work, not to undermine the imagination that they have, and not to bring in external consultants who might have the language but may not have the feeling. So we used a lot of visual approaches, and it doesn't matter, one doesn't have to be an expert and skilled in drawing, but it is more about tapping into that imagination that we have in our core. So I love this because truly speaking, we felt that these young girls who were living their realities, who were going through their own dilemmas and paradoxes, as I like to believe, they had a beautiful way of understanding how things can coexist, what direction one could have taken. And from the most unbelievable spaces, I mean, not for me, of course, but for people who never thought that these people could also contribute to real problem solving, that's exactly where the larger idea sort of came in. The ones below that you can see are just a zoomed in way of ways in which we went past linguistic barrier when we were working on fairness and fair collaboration, where we asked people to actually share what fairness looks like in action in their contexts and all of that, and where are the problems, where are the barriers. Again, because of the visualization, the way in which people could speak about things, or the ideas which came out were so incredibly powerful. It would have never happened if we went uh, in the direction of just talking. And again, I'm just trying to talk about the fact that all of these people who were sharing their ideas, everyone said, oh, I can't draw. And I mean, we had to almost tell them that, that's the first thing human beings do. You don't write first. We learn how to write. Most, or a lot of people have bad handwriting. We are never embarrassed to show our handwriting to the world, but we are so embarrassed to do any kind of drawing and constantly giving a disclaimer that, oh, I'm not good at drawing. I mean, we are the ones who are judging ourselves for the most innate ability that we were born with, right? So it speaks about what schooling does, to us, and conditioning. And last but not the least, if you look at this, the on the right side of the screen, some of the white on black motifs that you see again comes from a project which is called Climate Compass. It's an initiative I had started, and it's to find a direction towards climate change beyond dread and indifference, beyond denial and jumping into problem solving, where we we were thinking of finding a direction towards climate change in a way in which hyper local narratives could actually let us know what climate change is looking like anywhere in the world. So we started that journey. This was that phase where young people that we had selected from India and Nepal um, went out in their own neighborhoods, spoke to people. They looked at the UNDP dictionary, and like for example, this image that you're seeing, it this was a part of a virtual exhibition that eventually happened. This is actually a card-based game that came out of it from the experiences that these young practitioners collected through different modes of storytelling, and people's lived experiences and actual situations led to the cards that you can see here, or the situations or the game design. So the games were not already existing games because there's no dearth of any of those, but gamification here became a way for people to actually live somebody else's reality, which were difficult for people to inhabit. And it's so easy to talk about empathy, but actually so difficult to practice it. So going past a typical template of empathy map and just filling it up and thinking I have developed empathy, this was really to find the narratives, to lift the narratives, to enable other people to live those narratives. And again, these motives sort of came into this phase, and that's how a lot of these words and terminologies in the UNDP Climate Dictionary came alive. These were some of the young people you can see, and that brings me to the next set of dualities about the past and the future, which I feel imagination helps in bridging, because we can't just talk about the past, not talk about the future, because more often than not, we talk about the future in a very past driven way, whether we want to believe it or not. And I feel, again, with my little experience, if there is a real poverty that I see around in the world today, it's a poverty of imagination, really. There is such dearth and scarcity of imagination that we are so stuck to where we are. And I do believe that in order to have better imagination, we need to go past the dualities of content and constructs, because we are guided by these. And content is not just textual, it could also be visual. We are constantly bombarded with things, and then we have different constructs which we are born with, sometimes things we acquire, sometimes we create our own constructs. So context is what keeps us grounded. That becomes the bridge to go past this kinds of dualities. And that sort of came out in the work that we had done with a very famous organization, a company in India, which is known to be um, very sustainability driven, climate driven. And we took our climate compass work in that space, again, working with 200 plus employees, trying to understand that, okay, you have a company vision and mission and values, but how much in a day to day, in the day to day life of a regular employee, climate change and climate related action and understanding really plays a role? Like, does it even feature? Do they even realize? So we took it over there and we worked. And again, I mean, I'm also trying to show a range of different kinds of things, because like I showed you the not a toolkit, which assume the shape of a toolkit, which is downloadable, printable, all of that. Then I showed you the virtual exhibition, which the earlier climate compass with the young people took. This one took the shape of, it's almost like a biennale, like if you've been to Venice Biennale or something like that. It's like that. There's a huge warehouse in the factories, basically, some of the factories which are no longer used for this company, in which a huge event is done for the last few years. It's called Conscious Collective. So, in an 800 square feet space, what we found through our research and storytelling and story gathering process in this organization took the shape of Climate Compass. And you can see that's me with a group of people. And it was somewhere where we brought in the idea of compass in terms of someone finding their own direction in that space with four constructs that we created in that space. And then these four directions were the four constructs where we spoke a lot about choices and consequences, role of policies and design and innovation, etc. And uh, this is where you can see that a lot of people went and they were, again, interacting with different things. There were activities over there, there were things to read. And very interestingly, we saw that in a space which had 10,000 plus visitors in 3 days, people did spend 1.5, 2 hours sometimes in an exhibition, because this was not an exhibition to consume, but it was an exhibition to actually engage with and have a dialogue with, and finding your own direction. So that's where again I feel that we often get stuck in the debate of inclusion and exclusion, and dialogues are what bind them together. And like that, um, people do speak about privilege. Sometimes we recognize, sometimes we don't recognize our privilege, and then we talk about discrimination. But what really, for me, bind these two or act as a bridge between these two is a sense of gratitude for especially those who recognize privilege, and fairness when you look at discrimination, because a lot of discrimination that happens uh, happen not because, again, I don't believe that always it is about intention. It is also that there are a lot of structural barriers, a lot of systemic uh, reasons why inclusion doesn't happen, and the politics of inclusion in itself, right? I mean, again, it's very easy to talk about pluriverse, but very difficult to actually practice that. So this is again a part of an ongoing initiative we have called Narrative Kitchen, where we believe narratives and hidden narratives become a way in which a kitchen is formed. The ingredients are actually narratives. It's not a recipe because it's not top down, it's not instructional. But like in a kitchen, when we have ingredients, with the same ingredients, one can actually create infinite possibilities. So it becomes a kitchen of narratives. And we have worked in different spaces. So again, this particular phase of the work was to find out barriers to finding narratives. And we worked in a place called Kochi in Kerala, in India, southwest India. And a group of people, like group of 29 people, uh, experienced a place where in a 4 kilometer radius, there are 35 plus communities. And how do you not miss out on anyone? How do you really listen to all the voices? Was where we were looking at. And this is a classic example of how a narrative kitchen is often run. Uh, it could actually happen through food, like as a material. But mostly the idea is that food becomes an enabler, it becomes a hook through which conversations can be raised. So food over there, therefore, becomes a material, a medium, a metaphor, and more. And through this narrative kitchen kind of processes, we often engage in conversations around power and privilege, looking into where are we situated. Are we at the center, or are we at the periphery, or we sort of don't know? And that's where I often try to sort of understand, um, one has to go past this dichotomy of individual and collective, because one doesn't exist without the other one. And it's in an exchange between these two that we constantly keep the individual alive. It's very important, but we also work in a collective way, and it needs to happen through a lot of different kinds of exchanges. And that also allows us to go past the dichotomies of good and bad, because it is all about perspectives. And so you see over here, I chose some of these images because it's a program I'm very, very happy to be and proud to be a part of. It's called Responsible Futures. It's an Erasmus program amongst 3 universities in Europe, and Lucas School of Art, University of Aveiro, Portugal, and Lucas School of Art is in Belgium, and Sheffield Hallam University in the UK. And we are visiting scholars in this program, and we really had that absolute honor of being invited last year when it started. It's called Response Able Future, so it's about designing ability, designing for health and care. And it was a program where there were 20 plus students from 20 plus countries who were there, and we were asked to design collaborations which were meaningful through a process of intercultural meaning making, even from the look. and the way people are dressed, you can understand that there was absolutely no commonality. It was so difficult to actually have conversations because the previous slide which I was showing you, which was about good and bad, you might say, oh, well, that's a cliche. Everyone knows life is not about good and bad. But trust me, when you bring in culture and culture related conversations, we don't realize that we have our judgments and assumptions. A lot of that is rooted in what we think is good and bad, what we think should be or should not be. And so this was an amazing opportunity we had where we again use food and narrative kitchen kind of methodologies you can see here with local communities to bring in a lot of our own biases, a lot of our own perspectives, and tried to figure out ways in which we could come together. This was in a place called Genk in Belgium. And on the other hand, this is another program where we had the honor again at the Breda University of Applied Sciences in the Netherlands. And this was a group of people in a semester coming from different walks of life, from hospitality, tourism, etc. And this was a program on urban life and placemaking. We again had the privilege and the the challenge of designing an experience which would enable the group of people to stay together. Now, if you notice the previous one, diversity in a very explicit way could be the challenge and could be also the advantage, right? Here, just from the look, you won't have so much diversity because most people are, you can just appearance wise you can see they're very homogeneous. So we had to figure out how they're different, how like how do they celebrate their differences, and difference becomes actually a way to design with, and not really something that one has to counter. And again, these conversations became of paramount importance, of power. And, it's also something that I wanted to tell you that, we all represent countries. And I know I'm going to sound a bit controversial here for some people, not for me. We belong to countries, and in a very hyper nationalistic sort of an environment, we often also work in spaces where, let's say, my passport might be saying that I belong to a country, and I'm working with people whose passports are supposed to be enemy countries, right? And I think I again have had that absolute privilege of being in these kind of situations. And I feel these are such beautiful spaces to really build connections. And this photo, for various reasons, I chose because there were different kinds of people here who came from countries who are supposed to be not so friendly with the nation state that I, let's say, I represent, not internally but through my passport, and how we all were laughing about the barriers that we create. We were like holding each other, people were crying, and people were talking about these are the best friendships that we have ever developed. And likewise, I've had the fortune of facilitating like programs and leadership programs, etc. Like this is one such program called Seed. I've had the fortune of co-facilitating and designing for 3.5 years. It was across Southeast Asia and the UK, and the idea was to come together, work in different Southeast Asian contexts, and work towards sustainable development goals using creative means. It was again beautiful to be working with spaces where again different kinds of people who, from their so-called identity of which nation state they belong to, may not be friendly with each other, but how would you design collaboration where dialogues can emerge? So I wanted to sort of have that, and that's where I feel that it's so important to recognize interbeing in a world which is divided into parts and whole. Easy to talk about systems and systems thinking, but really difficult. And so this image again that I had shown you before is something that came as an imagery of interbeing through the Fair Collaboration Toolkit. Hence, I wanted to have that. And again, to completely contrasting context where in one, I had the opportunity to work with co-founders, directors of of an organization which works in social impact and learning, whereas the top one was people who most people would never bother talking to because you don't think they can think. You just feel that they sort of life happens to them. But the kind of wealth of experiences and perspectives these people would have shared were so much richer and so much wiser than the so-called big names, people who come from privilege, and power, the kind of things that they have to share. And that's where I always believe in looking at anything which is deemed as a problem from many points of view, not go into question and answer, but in reframing those, not just thinking about what do we keep and what do we kill, but I feel narratives really help in uh, going past this kind of a duality, understanding the politics even through a cultural lens, not just socioeconomic, ecological, those kinds of lenses, but the cultural lens becomes very important to make choices. And these choices are never about right and wrong. It is, like one always has to delve into the in between of the right and wrong and then only decide what is to be done. So again, like this image is where we were working with a very big corporation for their corporate citizenship program. Like this one I was showing you was with a group of people who work on development communication, particularly climate related communication, helping them make choices and go past the what and the why and looking into the what if. Similarly, again, you can see that we work on different contexts. Even the external context becomes very important. Like, how does someone look into something when they're in a boardroom versus someone, like a lot of different kinds of people. These people work in, again, sustainability and regenerative economy and all of that. But if you see that people were working next to the sea beach, so how does that kind of an environment, external, also help us go past the dichotomies of old and new and look into really the journey? Again, this was in the Netherlands, a group of people who were trying to look into the old with the lenses of the new and the contemporary. And that's where I believe that design needs to go past medium and message and look into metaphors, because metaphors are extremely important. This is again, actually, I chose this. These are interaction design students, final year students from a university in India, in the west of India, where again, they were, as a group of people, it was very hard for them to come together. And then they were talking about designing with people and designing for good. And we were sort of working with them to sort of say, okay, how can you be designers where you are either going into this whole thing of either following something or someone or an ideology or doubting? And that's where we believe that inquiry plays a role to go past the duality of following and doubting and that. So again, interaction design students who were working on their own biases and conditioning and questioning themselves. And this is my final duality and the paradox, one of my favorites. And I do believe that as creative practitioners, designers, scholars, academicians, whoever we are, with or without the labels, it's really a fine balance between freedom and structure. The question should never be about do we need freedom or do we need structure? Because I do believe one doesn't exist without the other. Without structure, freedom doesn't assume the meaning that it has. Without freedom, structure feels like a prison. So it really is a dance or a choreography that we need to all be very good at. Rhythm really becomes the bridge between freedom and structure, I believe. And I'm not speaking philosophically at all. I do believe, and of course, if we had more time, I could give you examples to say how these become conscious choices for me. These become ingredients through which I design, even something like a research that I do. And yeah, that's about my journey for today, about the duality paradox within which I'm constantly trying to balance and navigate and trying to find my own compass. So, yeah, that's who I am. I'm Sudebi, from India. But as I say, that I'm a cosmopolitan local. The world is my family. I do believe in it. And I do love to therefore work with the different dualities and the paradoxes of those that each one of us embody and each one of us stand for. Thank you.